some things that have changed, right? So major historical developments resulting in a reduction in dose to patients or staff or radiographers. So first off, the first discovery is in 1896. Again, less than a year after the discovery of X-rays. The next year, Thomas Edison, you guys heard his name already, he gives us something called a fluorescent intensifying screen. Okay, I don't know if you recall, because I've said a lot today, but when I said like Edison and Clarence Daly playing with his hands on the thing, or Röntgen and his wife, they had to do exposures that were minutes long. Like Röntgen's wife's hand X-ray took like 5 minutes, 4 or 5 minutes to expose. She had to hold her hand still for 4 or 5 minutes to make that exposure. But you know now, we take X-rays and we expose within milliseconds, right? Our time is always milliseconds or very, very shortly, just seconds. We never have done a minute-long or multi-minute long exposure. So why is that? Well, that came from Edison. He created something which called an intensifying screen. So basically, I'm trying to look if I have it in here. Basically, all that X-ray cassettes used to be is they used to be thick cardboard. Okay, you took a piece of film, photographic film, in a dark room, and you sandwiched it between cardboard, and you closed up the sides of the cardboard. That was it. That was a piece of photo. That was an X-ray cassette back then. Okay, now without any intensifying screens, what exposed the photographic film? When Edison and Röntgen were doing their first X-rays, what was exposing the film? It's the obvious answer. What made the exposure? The X-rays. Yeah, the X-rays exposed the X-ray film. Now if you're going, well, duh, the X-rays exposed the X-ray film, it's an X-ray machine, right? You should know that when you guys make X-rays now, your X-rays are not exposing the plate, the imaging plate. They're not exposing the film. Inside of the imaging plate, the X-rays are striking something called an intensifying screen. And when they strike the intensifying screen lights up in a visible light, and that exposes the photographic film. Okay, so it's a multi-step process. This is not digital radiography. This is not the direct digital that we talked about last time. This is film radiography. Okay, in a film cassette, there are, even in digital cassettes, but in a film cassette, there are things called intensifying screens. So they are white sheets of film, okay, that sit on either side of the actual piece of film, okay. When X-rays strike the cassette, the intensifying screens glow. That glow in visible light is what exposes the film inside of the cassettes. This takes the radiation dose and cuts it down by hundreds of times, okay? Because it's easier to expose photographic film with visible light than it is to do with X-rays. It would take minutes to expose a photographic film, where it only takes milliseconds to expose photographic film with light, with visible light. So a fluorescent intensifying screen is something that takes the X-ray energy and converts it into visible light and exposes the film with that. Okay, that's 1896. Screen cassettes are the same thing, but placed inside of a cassette. Those are what you would think of now as being like an X-ray cassette. 1896, somebody named Michael Pupin. X-ray beam filtration, okay, and restriction. As you guys saw, right, there was, the X-ray tubes that I showed you in the pictures that you've seen, basically are just like an open light bulb, okay? Edison's thing that he had in the beginning of this was just a wooden box, right, that like just let X-rays out of it in all directions. Well, what we learned is that if we take and put the X-ray tube inside of something like this, okay, put the X-ray tube inside of a lead box, all right, and then in the bottom of the box, we had a way for the X-rays to get out, okay, an opening. Then we could take and we could put what would be called a collimator in the path of the beam, and it would keep the beam from just traveling in every direction. That's what's called beam filtration and restriction, okay? They would take, and they could put this right in the way. And this is just like your dental X-rays, right? You guys go to get a dental X-ray, they put that tube thing up to your mouth, right? That's what this is. The dental X-ray is just a small X-ray tube, okay, with this thing called a collimator. And this is a cone type collimator, but there are cylindrical types such as you would see in the dental X-ray room, okay? And that's all it is. It would just sit in the way, and it would restrict the beam to this area here. Okay. Modern day collimators look like this. Okay. They sit like here. Okay. And what they have is they have knobs. And these knobs control, it's hard to see, but these knobs control an opening that moves lead strips back and forth. There's one knob for lead strips going this way, and another knob for lead strips going the other direction. And you can make a square radiation field with this, and you can change its size. Okay, so this is a modern collimator. This would be an old style collimator, just a cylinder. Okay, but beam restriction as a concept didn't happen until 1899. Okay, that is only a few years after the discovery of X-rays. And William Rawlins was a dentist. Okay, and we still use his dental collimators to this day. This is a cone one, but you know that ones we use in dental offices are typically cylinders. We still use them in dental offices. The next discovery is AEC, automatic exposure control. This is a way to take the settings out of the equation, right? We don't make any settings. The computer or the machine, we tell it, here's how much energy we want the beam to have, okay? And you, machine, shut off the exposure when the patient's received enough, when the image has gotten enough exposure. You shut off, okay? Shut off on your own. It was called photo timing or automatic exposure control. And it basically took and decreased the number of repeats we would have to do because the machine could shut off the exposure when it was enough, when the exposure was at the right levels. So we didn't overexpose or underexpose our patients. 1942, Russell Morgan. Fluoroscopy is video X-ray, and an image intensifier is a device that basically takes the signal coming off of the patient and does what it says. It intensifies the signal so we can use less radiation dose to create our fluoroscopic video X-ray image. That was made in 1948. We don't need to know much about image intensifiers. A new type of intensifying screen called rare earth phosphors, 1972. And in the 90s, we get digital radiography. We've been working with digital radiography since the 90s. Okay, so those are some things that radiography has discovered to lower patient dose, to decrease the number of repeats, thereby lowering patient dose, and make our job safer for us as well as our patients. Okay. Let's go back to our frame of reference comparisons. Okay. So environmental radiation, right? We talked about natural background. We talked a little bit about 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, but let's put them back on the table again. 3 Mile Island. There it is, 1979. I knew it wasn't. Oh, it was before Chernobyl. My bad. In any case, 3 Mile Island, nuclear power plant, disaster. Average exposure to the general public, 15 microgray. Not even a single chest x-ray worth. About 1/7 of a single chest x-ray. Couple of days of natural background. Nothing too bad. Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident, 1985. Okay. By the way, there's our fantastic docudrama about Chernobyl. It's got like Stellan Skarsgård in it. It's a great short docudrama. I encourage you to watch it. But in any case, and there's plenty of stuff about Chernobyl you can find on Netflix and blah, 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 all kinds of stuff. So if you want to learn anything about Chernobyl, you can. It's all out there. But average exposure to survivors, 450 milligray, as we said. That's enough to cause the beginnings of radiation syndromes, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea syndrome to be specific. It can damage the intestinal system. Local villagers, until they evacuated, some didn't, by the way. There's documentaries about people who stayed behind and are in all respects pretty okay, right? But anyways, some people stayed behind. Those people received, at least in the beginning stages, 250 milligray per hour. Okay, every hour that they stayed there, 250 milligray. Most of those people died if they did not evacuate quickly, because as I said, 6 or so grays is lethal dose, and they're receiving that to their entire body. By the way, when I say entire body, it matters. If I got 6 grays to like my index finger, that's different than getting 6 grays to my whole body. It matters how much body tissue gets irradiated. So when I say whole body, I'm saying it for a good reason. Many firemen and victims received more than 2 gray. In fact, the hospital, this is kind of interesting, after this happened, a lot of the firefighters were the first people sent in, and they weren't actually told. They said they were told it was a fire that they were going to. So they were not told the nuclear power plant exploded. They knew they were going to the power plant, but they were not told it exploded. They went in, rushed in to put out the fire, and were standing in and around all of the nuclear radioactive elements that had exploded and were just on the ground. Okay, they were right next to it. They were receiving so much radiation that many of them died within the first few days of acute radiation syndrome, and they're getting more than 2 gray in those first minutes and hours. They got taken to the hospital, and a smart nurse in that hospital knew that their clothing was going to be covered in radioactive elements, right? Radioactive material. So they stripped all the firefighters and got all their clothes off, put them in hospital gowns, right? They're themselves radioactive because of the exposure, but their clothes are too. And they took all their clothes and they piled them into the basement of the hospital, just as far away from people as they could. Still to this day, you can go to that hospital. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily open, but people have gone. You can, in principle, go to that hospital, down to the basement, and there is a pile of firefighter clothes, okay? And you can take a Geiger counter and you can measure the radioactivity on those clothes, and they are still very radioactive. And it's kind of crazy. If you've seen anything about Chernobyl, basically everyone just picked up and left, like, immediately, right? So everything's kind of as it was, and that hospital is as it was, and the pile of clothes is just sitting right there, because who's going to go clean that up? There's no reason to. The whole area's been evacuated. But those people got so much radiation dose that their clothes are still radioactive to this day, and many of them died within days and hours after the incident. 31 acute deaths. That's 31 people died immediately because of such high levels of radiation. They just got nervous system syndrome and died because their nervous systems just got overloaded, and they basically died because their brain just started hemorrhaging. All their blood vessels broke open and they died. 203 cases of acute radiation syndrome, ARS, which only happens when you get above a couple of gray, and 500 hospitalizations. Those are the workers and the firefighters that actually made it out. Some got so much they just would have died right there. So 3 Mile Island, 17 curies. Chernobyl, 50 million curies. I know I haven't given you the unit of curies yet, but you get the relative difference between 17 and 50 million. It's a big difference. The total meltdown at Chernobyl is responsible for at least 5,000 early deaths in Eastern Europe, which is why they call it a true environmental catastrophe, whereas 3 Mile Island didn't hurt anybody actually. There's nobody actually linked to being hurt by 3 Mile Island. And the reason why we're using all these scary, atomic bomb drops and the explosion of power plants is because we don't have other good examples of when people were exposed to high amounts of radiation in short periods of time. These are the only ones that we have, the only data that we have to go off of. This is why we use these to talk about. Atom bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as you know, they dropped 2 on 2 separate times. Average exposure to survivors, 2 gray, which is more than the lethal dose, which is more than enough to cause death. A small note that the modern hydrogen bombs are a lot more powerful, so if anything were to happen nowadays, it would be way worse. We hope that does not happen. So at more than 1 gray to the whole body, the exposure is large enough to start killing people. Some people will die. 3.5 to 4 gray is what's called the LD5030. You'll need to remember these. This is your first introduction to these terms. We'll give them to you again later. The LD50-30 is what's called the lethal dose to 50% of the population within 30 days. If you give this much radiation to a population, half of them die within a month. That's LD50-30. At greater than 7 gray to the whole body, no one has been documented to survive that. Above 7 gray, 100% of people die. That's the LD100. Okay, so these are our levels at which serious things begin happening, and above 1 gray, acute radiation syndrome can begin. And there's different levels of ARS, acute radiation syndrome, which we'll talk about in upcoming lectures, just introducing you guys to the terms today. Okay, so that is a little bit about perspective, getting a frame of reference for environmental radiation.